some, investing in whiskey rather than drinking it might be a cardinal sin. But with rapidly rising prices, most collectors are taking their passion for the spirit with a spot of speculation. I'm joined by Neil Patterson, the co-owner of Whisky Brother, and he's here to tell us about how you can get into investing in whiskey. Neil, thank you so much for your time. So talk to me about how you got into collecting whiskey.
Yeah, I mean, I think like with any investment, having a keen interest is always a good thing if you're going to invest yourself. We started years ago small, you buy a $500 bottle, and you manage to not consume it. Obviously, that's key because obviously if you drink it, it loses all its value. And you hang on to it for 2-3 years and you see that, it's now worth quite a bit more money. And you start to say, hang on, here's something perhaps worth looking into a little bit deeper. And you look for closed distilleries or limited releases, bottles that perhaps are a little bit more hard to come by. And it's a simple supply and demand situation. Supply is small, demand is high, and you've got a good investment on your hands.
When you look at the demand in South Africa versus globally in terms of whiskey collection, what does that look like?
The demand here is high. There are lots of collectors in South Africa. I mean, a lot of them are unknown, and we do know a lot of guys that have bottle collections over 1,000 bottles sitting at home. And from a value proposition, upwards of R1 million or more for those collections. So there is demand, absolutely. I think the problem with whiskey, and I mean whether it's a problem or not, is that your friends, your children, yourself, you can consume your investment and it can be gone in a matter of hours. So you need to have controls in place to make sure that's not going to happen. And of course you need to be insured as well. Insurance is key. When we started out 10 odd years ago, we had some 50 odd bottles removed from our share house back in the day, which obviously was pretty brutal pill to swallow at the time. So be insured, well insured.
When you look at the precautions that have been put into place with regards to social distancing measures, people are so used to going to whiskey tastings and whiskey festivals, and that may not necessarily be the case right now. So if you're thinking of getting into the entire space, how would you go about it?
Thankfully at the moment, the bar here in Morningside is open and our store in Hyde Park is open. So you can walk in and chat to a whiskey expert and ask their opinion. There are still lots of good limited releases coming into the country. Maybe not as many as there used to be, but there still are good options out there for guys to buy if they're interested in getting involved. The key is engaging with somebody who knows more than you. So if you don't live in Johannesburg, you're welcome to drop us an email, info@whiskybrother.com, and we'll happily help you with a valuation, or if you're interested in investing, a little bit of advice.
You mentioned that you have a whiskey fund. Tell me a little bit more about it and how does one get involved?
So we've got a small whiskey fund based out of Singapore. It essentially is like any unitized sort of fund where you're buying a unit into a greater basket of whiskey. We currently hold 42 casks, those are barrels of whiskey from various distilleries around the globe, including the US and Scotland. And then we hold around 800 odd whiskey bottles, from incredibly rare to maybe not that rare, where there's say 5,000 or 6,000 bottle release globally, and we manage to get our hands on 2 or 3 of them. The short-term returns on those bottles are generally very good. Within a year, you will usually see 25% return on those. So those are sort of fast-moving, and then your sort of bigger, high-end bottles, 50,000 Rand plus bottles, we usually like to hang on to those for 2 to 5 years before we sell them on auction to get our returns.
What is the risk profile for this particular fund?
At the moment, quite low. Again, nobody can see into the future. The last 6 months, whiskey prices have shot up quite heavily. We assume it's because a lot of high net worth individuals have decided to start drinking their expensive stuff because, I think COVID has made sure we're all vividly aware of our mortality. So we have seen a bump in prices, which, is good from an investment point of view, but not good, obviously, if you want to consume it.
What is the ultimate whiskey collection?
That's a good question. Brand is key, like with anything. You can have let's not be rude, but you can have a Haval, a car that looks exactly like a Ferrari, but it's not going to fetch the same amount of money as the Ferrari, simply because the badge is different. Everything about that car could be identical, but the badge is different. So certain brands are absolutely more desirable than others. Generally what you want to look for is limited release, single cask, ideally from a top tier brand. Macallan, for example, Springbank, Lagavulin. If there's these sorts of very limited release products coming from a top tier distillery, the global demand is going to be big. If you think about how many high net worth individuals live in, say, Chicago, let's say dollar millionaires, it's around 10,000. And you take that to one city, how many of them are interested in, say, buying the latest release fine oak, for example, or fine and rare bottle, and there's only 200 or 300 going globally. So you can understand that everybody's fighting for a very small parcel of whiskey. It's going to drive the price up. Obviously, it's not always easy to come by these bottles.
When you look at age, does it still play a factor in that?
Age is still a factor. No age statement is a massive part of whiskey these days. And the reality is the demand globally is up for aged whiskey, how do you plan for the demand? Well, a 12-year-old whiskey, the guys had to decide 12 years ago how much to make for today. And of course, the demand 12, 15 years ago wasn't as high as it is today. So they weren't producing as much. How this no age statement has come about is that, you can essentially produce a younger whiskey, 5, 6, 7 years old, put a cool name on it. Don't disclose the age as long as it's over 3 years old, and you can obviously sell it. Some of these bottles are worth buying. Some of them perhaps not, from an investment point of view. A lot of them are great drinking, but from a strictly investment point of view, be careful. Rather stick with age, vintage in particular, and lower quantity, lower releases. The less bottles released, the better.
You often talk about storage when it comes to wine and where you should put it. The same would go for art. When it comes to whiskey and you've got your first rare collection, what should you bear in mind in terms of storage? And most importantly, I suppose, how does one enjoy a really good whiskey?
Thankfully, whiskey is a lot hardier than wine. You don't need a fancy fridge or anything like that. I store my whiskey on the south side of my house, so it's slightly cooler. You store it upright because the alcohol is so high that if you lie it on its side, it can actually eat away at the cork and damage the cork. So as long as you've got it sort of under 25 degrees and above 5 degrees, you're pretty safe, and it'll outlast all of us. In 100 years, you'll open it and it'll still taste perfectly delicious. So thankfully, there's not much risk there.